Syndrome invented by white people to discourage lovers. That's what they often call AIDS in Ivory Coast. In spite of years of education and raising public awareness within the country, there is still a large sector of the population that refuses to acknowledge the existence of HIV. Among the youth, there are those who are willing to acknowledge its existence theoretically, but few are willing to consider the risks personally. Far and wide, it is a taboo, something to be discussed in theory, but never in your own backyard, in your own home, or in your own body. It is too frightening. It is too awful to even be considered. AIDS is still the word that too often remains unspoken. In the past 18 months, in our clinic in Ibangru, Ivory Coast, we have tested 1,390 people for the HIV virus. Of those tested, 369 people have tested positive. 369 people. Mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, sons and daughters. Each one has a story. Each one has a role they play in society. Each one means something to someone, and without treatment, each one will more than likely die within the next few years. Even with treatment, their lives, and the lives of those they love, will be irrevocably changed. So what is a missionary to do? How are we supposed to equip the community to manage a crisis that many people won't even acknowledge? How are we supposed to teach families and neighbors to reach out to people living with AIDS, when to announce that one is infected with the virus is automatically to induce fear and panic in their community and to be ostracized because of that fear? Women are afraid to tell their husbands that they are infected for fear that they will be beaten and chased from their homes, left with no one to provide for them. Young adolescents are afraid to tell their parents for fear that they will be kicked out of the household, forced from school, and sentenced to a future void of any hope. Old men are afraid to tell their families for fear that their wives will leave them or that their children will stop caring for them, and they will be forced to live out the remainder of their years far alone, far from anyone they love. Because of this, the cycle continues. No one asks, no one tells, no one speaks out for truth and education, and the virus is passed from person to person, husband to wife, mother to child, with no end in sight. This is an overwhelming reality for any missionary working with AIDS in Africa. It often seems hopeless, like we're paddling upstream to plug holes in the dam and we've run out of fingers. What's the point, we ask ourselves, and we begin to believe that things will never change. But today, for the first time, today I had a glimmer of hope. It was small, just a twinkling of promised progress. Most Americans may not have even noticed it. But, after 9 years living in this country, to me, it was nothing short of miraculous. Today, I sat in on a support group meeting for people living with HIV/AIDS. Wisdom, our clinic pastor, and Conan, our clinic administrator, who himself lost his wife to AIDS a few years ago, began the group in April of this year, and have been asking me for months to attend one of their meetings. This month I didn't have a conflict in my schedule, so I thought I would drop in and make an appearance. It was raining at the time the meeting was supposed to begin, so at first I wasn't too impressed with the 3 people who had shown up. This is a good start, I thought, but what are these 3 people going to do? Wisdom, reading the unspoken thoughts in my mind, told me to wait and be patient. They'll come, he said. You'll see. So I waited. As the rain began to stop, the room began to fill with faces, first 10, then 20. Finally, there were 40 people in all, and Wisdom said that there were another 10 or so who weren't able to make it. Some were faces I knew from my work in the clinic, others were faces I knew from church on Sundays, and others, faces I have known around town for years, but very few of them were faces that I had associated with AIDS. Racism and social prejudices play a large role in the culture of Ivory Coast. The social and cultural boundaries are firmly drawn, yet as I gave up my seat to the newcomers and moved to a stool on the floor, I looked around me and saw Muslims, Christians, and animists, religious groups that just don't mix in Ivory Coast. There were Anyi and Jula, Mosi, Baole, and Yakuba, people groups who just don't mix in Ivory Coast. There were teachers, pastors' wives, vendors, farmers, and businessmen, social groups that just don't mix in Ivory Coast. They were meeting together in one room with one purpose, and that was to form a group to stand together against the destructive forces of AIDS that had touched each and every one of their lives. Not only were they brave enough to admit that they themselves were infected with the virus, they were willing to break free from the constraints of their culture to say, "We are different, but we are united in our effort to help each other." Those who are familiar with Africa know that this is an amazing step. I was truly humbled by their courage and honesty and willingness to risk so much to reach out to others to help and to accept help when needed. Today, the group decided that they needed a name since Auto Support Group didn't seem to catch the essence of what they were doing, and many people didn't really understand what it meant anyway. It didn't take them long to come up with a name that they unanimously felt explained why they were there. Amitié et solidarité. Friendship and unity. The simplicity and the truth of what they were saying brought tears to my eyes. They are from extremely varied walks of life, walks that never would have intersected but for an ugly disease called AIDS. And now it has unified them, empowered them, and brought them together to become a second family, as they described it, with each saying to the other, "I will be responsible for you. I will carry you through." I could think of no better example of Galatians 6:2 and bearing one another's burdens. The wonderful, amazing thing about this group is that they are doing the work themselves. They are meeting together with no missionary leadership. They are in the process of developing their own micro-enterprise project that will be specifically used for benevolent needs within the group, using their own resources. The Christians in the group are finding ways to witness to and teach those in the group that don't yet know Christ. It is beautiful to see, and even more wonderful to know, that long after we missionaries are gone, this work will go on because it belongs to the people involved and not to any of us who are just passing through. Last week, as I worked in the clinic seeing patients, we had a 100% day, meaning that 100% of the people we tested for HIV were positive for the virus. I stood in the lab looking over the results with the clinic employees. 100%, I sighed. 100%. What are you going to do? I asked. What are you Africans going to do? This is going to kill you all if you don't do something about it. They were as discouraged as I was and responded, "We don't know, but we have to do something. If we don't, we're all dead." That question, however, is not theirs alone to answer. I can and should ask the same question of myself and of Christians everywhere. What are we going to do? This isn't Africa's problem, it's the world's problem. And more precisely, I believe it is the church's problem. Therefore, I ask you, what are we going to do? Obviously, we can't fix the problem, but how can we help them help themselves? What resources do we have to offer that can help them start on a path towards wholeness, physically and spiritually, as individuals and as a society? How do we imitate our Savior, who came to bind up the brokenhearted and bring good news to the poor, comfort those who mourn, and set the captives free? It was He who said, "To whom much is given, much is required." In 2005, UN AIDS statistics found that although only 10% of the world's population lived in sub-Saharan Africa, 60% of the world's HIV infections were found here. 25.8 million people were known to be infected, and over 12 million children had already been orphaned by AIDS. The statistics are overwhelming, especially when you consider that each of those 25.8 million infected people have a name. Each of those 12 million orphans has a face. They are not statistics. They are people ravaged by a ruthless, indiscriminate killer that is changing the face of Africa forever. In a place already infested with poverty and war and a cultural climate steeped in tradition and not receptive to change, the statistics seem overwhelming and the task at hand insurmountable. Last Wednesday, faced with these statistics and a 100% day, as I left the clinic for home, I was ready to give up. Then today happened. Today, I sat next to Jean-Francois and Estelle. I prayed in a room with Kadi and Suleiman. I shook the hand of Akasi and patted the pregnant belly of Sarah, and I was encouraged by the little glimmer of hope that I saw. I heard a subtle whisper of change. They say that AIDS changes things, and undoubtedly that's true. But I think they were talking about societies, infrastructures, and economies changing for the worst. I would have to agree with them in that respect. But there's another aspect to consider. AIDS is changing things, And today I witnessed it with my own 2 eyes. AIDS is bringing people together. It is tearing down and trampling the boundaries of culture and prejudice. It is raising its voice and saying, "We are here, and we will be heard. If you will not look out for us, we will look out for each other." It is paving the way for change and evangelism, and I firmly believe with all my heart that with enough education, enough resources, and enough encouragement, these people, through the power of Christ, will change things for the better. Of that I have no doubt.